Have you ever looked at something in history and wondered, how could anyone have gone along with that? Maybe it was Nazi Germany. Maybe it was Jonestown. Maybe it was a company scandal where thousands of employees stayed silent. Or maybe it was just someone in your own life who kept following a leader long after it stopped making sense. From the outside, it's easy to think, I would have been different. I would have spoken up. I would have walked away. But what if the people who said yes believed the exact same thing? One of the most famous experiments ever conducted asked an unsettling question. Not whether bad people would hurt someone, but whether ordinary people would. The answer changed the way we understand human behavior forever, because it suggested something most of us still don't want to believe. The greatest danger isn't that evil people exist. It's that ordinary people can slowly find themselves doing things they never imagined, simply because someone they trusted told them to keep going. Welcome back to The Human Pattern. I'm Liv. And before we jump in, if you're curious about why people think, feel, and behave the way they do, I'd love for you to subscribe or follow the podcast. And if you find yourself leaving an episode with more questions than answers, then you're exactly where I hope you'll be. So subscribe wherever you're listening so you don't miss future conversations. All right, let's get into it. Today, we're exploring one of the most uncomfortable questions we've ever asked on this podcast. Not because it's about history or psychology, but because it's about us. We all like to believe that we're independent thinkers, that our values guide our decisions, that if someone asked us to do something we believed was wrong, we'd simply say no. It feels obvious, almost automatic. But human behavior is rarely that simple. One of the biggest themes we've explored throughout this podcast is that we often judge ourselves by our intentions, while our behavior is shaped by forces we don't even notice: our environment, the people around us, our emotions, our past experiences. And today, authority. Because authority is one of the most powerful forces shaping human behavior. Most of the time, that's a good thing. We trust pilots to fly airplanes, doctors to perform surgeries, firefighters during emergencies. Society couldn't function without some degree of trust and cooperation. But every strength has a shadow. What happens when the person giving the orders is wrong? And questioning them feels harder than obeying them. And perhaps the most uncomfortable question of all, would you even realize it was happening? In 1961, a psychologist named Stanley Milgram designed an experiment to explore those questions. More than 60 years later, people are still arguing about what it reveals. Not because the experiment was shocking, but because the results continue to challenge our deepest beliefs. That we'd always know when it's time to say no. Let's explore why that assumption might not be as safe as we'd like to think. Before we talk about what happened, I want you to imagine that you've just answered a newspaper advertisement. It says researchers at Yale University are looking for volunteers to participate in a study about learning and memory. Sounds harmless, right? You show up, the campus is exactly what you'd expect: professional, respected, academic. The researcher greets you in a gray lab coat. Another volunteer is already waiting, friendly, easy to talk to. Nothing feels unusual. If anything, it feels reassuring. After all, this is Yale, one of the most respected universities in the world. The researcher explains that one of you will be the teacher and the other will be the learner. The learner memorizes pairs of words. The teacher tests him on it. To make things fair, you both draw slips of paper to determine your roles. You draw teacher. What you don't know is that the drawing has been rigged. The other participant isn't really a volunteer, he's actually part of the experiment. Every real participant becomes the teacher, every single time. The learner is taken into another room. Before he leaves, you watch the researcher strap him into a chair and attach electrodes to his arm. The learner mentions almost casually that he has a heart condition. And for just a second, you hesitate. But the researcher immediately reassures you both. The shocks may be painful, but they won't cause permanent tissue damage. And that sounds official, confident, scientific. And because it's coming from someone who appears to know exactly what he's talking about, you accept it. I mean, why wouldn't you? You didn't come here expecting to question the researchers. You came here because you trusted them. And that detail matters. One of the biggest mistakes we make when looking back at famous experiments is imagining the participants walked in expecting a moral dilemma. They didn't. They thought they were helping with scientific research, and everything about the environment told them the same thing. You're safe here, and the people in charge know what they're doing. Human beings don't make decisions in a vacuum. We make them based on information that we have, the people we trust, and the stories we're telling ourselves about what's happening. The participants weren't deciding whether to harm another person, at least not yet. They were simply trying to be good participants in what they believed was a legitimate scientific study. There's a huge difference between those two mindsets. And it's exactly why this experiment became so influential. Because the story doesn't begin with cruelty, it begins with trust. And sometimes that's exactly where the most difficult decisions begin. Now, the researcher leads you to another room. In front of you is a large machine with 30 switches, each one labeled with a voltage: 15, 30, 45, 60, climbing all the way to 450. Beneath the higher switches are labels: intense shock, extreme intensity shock, and eventually danger, severe shock. Before the experiment begins, you experience a sample shock yourself: 45 volts. Not unbearable, but enough to make one thing clear: the machine feels real. The learner is now in the next room, and you can't see him, but you can hear him. The instructions are very straightforward. Read pairs of words, and every time he answers wrong, you press the next switch. So the experiment begins. First mistake, 15 volts. Nothing unusual happens. Another wrong answer, 30. Still nothing. 45, 60, 75, and then you hear the learner grunt. It's the first sign that someone on the other side of the wall is actually experiencing discomfort. You pause. The researcher simply says, "Please continue." So you do. 90 volts, 105 volts. At 120, he says the shocks are becoming painful. By 150, everything changes. The learner calls out that he wants to stop, that he wants to be released. It feels like the obvious moment to say, "I'm done." But here's what's easy to miss. No one asked the participants to jump straight to 150 volts. They got there one decision at a time: 15, 30, 45, 60, 75, 90. Each step only slightly different from the one before it. If someone had greeted participants at the door and said, "Today, we'd like you to administer what you believe could be a dangerous electric shock to another person," almost everyone would have walked out. But that's not what happened. The requests were so small, so incremental, that each decision felt like a continuation of the last one, not a new one. And that pattern should sound familiar. People rarely wake up one morning believing something outrageous, or trapped in a relationship that stopped feeling safe, or working somewhere they can no longer defend. It happens the same way it happened in that room. One small step that resembled the step before it. Repeated until the distance traveled is only visible looking backward. The participants in Milgram's study weren't making one enormous decision. They were making dozens of tiny ones. And that's exactly what made the experiment so powerful. Not because it revealed something unusual about a handful of volunteers, but because it revealed something deeply human. We are remarkably good at adapting. Sometimes so good we don't notice how far we've traveled until we stop and look back. By the time the learner was begging to be released, the participants weren't making their first decision. They were making their 11th. And from that point forward, the real question wasn't whether the shocks would continue, it was whether the participants would. At 150 volts, the learner has asked to leave. In an ordinary interaction, that would be the end of it. But this wasn't an ordinary interaction. When participants hesitated, the researcher had a script. Not an argument, not a threat, just a series of calm, prepared responses. Please continue. If they hesitated again, the experiment requires that you continue. If they refused, it is absolutely essential that you continue. And finally, you have no other choice. You must go on. That's it. No shouting, no intimidation, no physical force, no promise of more money. Just a calm, confident researcher in a lab coat repeating the instructions. As the experiment continued, the learner's protests grew more desperate. He complained about his heart, begged to be let out, and eventually stopped responding altogether. Imagine sitting in that room. You've already pressed the button several times. The researcher seems completely calm, acting as though everything is proceeding exactly as planned. Meanwhile, the person in the next room has gone silent. What do you do? Some participants refused. Some stood up and walked out. Others argued with the researcher. Many actually laughed nervously, not because they found it funny, but because our brains sometimes respond to overwhelming stress in unexpected ways. Some were visibly shaking. One man became so distressed he trembled uncontrollably. These weren't people who enjoyed what was happening. Many looked miserable. They questioned what they were doing. They asked who would be responsible if something went wrong. The researcher answered simply, I am responsible. Not, nothing will happen. Not, you're wrong to be concerned. Just, I am responsible. And for many participants, that was enough. Not because they stopped caring, but because someone they believed had more knowledge, more authority, and more responsibility had just told them that the burden wasn't theirs to carry. Then came the results that stunned almost everyone. Before the experiment was conducted, psychologists, psychiatrists, and ordinary people were asked to predict what would happen. Most believed almost no one would continue to the highest voltage. Some estimated maybe one person in 1,000. Instead, 65% of participants continued all the way to what they believed was a 450-volt shock. Take a second to let that number sink in. These weren't criminals, and they weren't selected for violent personalities. They were teachers, salespeople, engineers, office workers, neighbors, people who answered a newspaper ad because they thought they were helping with research. The experiment didn't reveal that ordinary people are secretly evil. It revealed something more unsettling than that. Good intentions are not always enough to protect us. When authority, trust, gradual commitment, and uncertainty all come together, even decent people can find themselves making choices they never imagined they would make. Which raises a question just as important today as it was in 1961. Why does authority have such a powerful effect on us in the first place? Why would ordinary, compassionate people keep doing something that clearly made them uncomfortable? The easy answer is that they were weak, or gullible, or easily manipulated. But that explanation falls apart fast. Remember, experts predicted almost no one would continue. If psychologists got it wrong, this probably isn't a flaw in a handful of individuals. It's something more universal. The truth is, we're wired to follow authority for a reason. Imagine a world where no one listened to anyone else. Children ignoring their parents, passengers ignoring flight attendants mid-emergency, surgeons refusing to defer to the lead physician in the operating room. Society couldn't function that way. Cooperation is one of humanity's greatest strengths, and cooperation requires trust. Most of the time, following someone with more knowledge or experience really is the right call. The problem isn't that we trust authority. The problem is that our brains often assume legitimate authority is also moral authority, and those aren't always the same thing. A lab coat signals expertise. A judge's robe, a police uniform, a military rank, a CEO's title, a medical degree, none of it automatically makes a person right, but our brains give their opinions more weight anyway. It's a mental shortcut that usually serves us well, until it doesn't. Something else happens too. Responsibility begins to shift. Instead of asking, "Do I believe this is the right thing to do?" the question quietly becomes, "Am I doing what I'm supposed to do?" Psychologists call this a genic state. The shift from seeing yourself as the person making a decision to seeing yourself as the person carrying out someone else's decision. Notice how different those feel? "I chose this" versus "I was told to do this." The action may be identical, but the felt responsibility isn't. You've heard the phrases before. "I was just following orders." "I was just doing my job." "I didn't make the rules." Those statements don't erase responsibility, but they reveal something real about how the human mind works. We like to believe character alone determines behavior, when context, relationships, stress, social pressure, and authority all pull just as hard. That's uncomfortable because it means none of us are completely immune. But I think it's also the most valuable lesson Milgram left us. Not that people are destined to obey, but that understanding the forces acting on us makes us far more likely to notice them while they're happening. Awareness doesn't guarantee we'll make the right choice. It just gives us the chance to pause, to ask a question, to think for ourselves before simply continuing. Because the most dangerous moment isn't when someone gives you a bad order. It's the moment you stop asking whether it's a bad order at all. So if obedience comes this naturally, how do we avoid becoming one of those people who simply keeps going? Milgram didn't stop after the original experiment. Over the years, he ran dozens of variations, changing the setting, the distance between the participant and the learner, who gave the instructions, and each one taught us something new. When the authority figure wasn't physically in the room, obedience dropped. A confident person standing a few feet away turned out to have far more influence than someone giving instructions over the phone. Presence matters. When participants had to physically place the learner's hand on the shock plate themselves, obedience dropped again. The closer people felt to the actual consequences, the harder it became to continue. Distance matters. But my favorite variation involved a second participant who was also secretly working with the researchers, and partway through simply refused to continue. He questioned the researcher. He stopped. And something remarkable happened. Many of the real participants stopped too. One person speaking up made it dramatically easier for someone else to do the same. We tend to imagine bravery as a fixed personality trait, something you either have or don't. Milgram's research suggests something completely different. Sometimes courage is social. Seeing one person question authority gives everyone else permission to do the same. It's a reminder that you're not the only one who feels uncomfortable. That's relevant everywhere. At work, in school, in a friend group, on social media, even in our own families. Sometimes all it takes is one person asking, "Can we slow down for a second? Why are we doing this? Is this actually the right thing to do?" Those questions interrupt momentum. They create room to think. And often, that's all it takes. The lessons from Milgram isn't that authority is dangerous. We need authority. We need experts. We need leaders. The lesson is that no person, no institution, no title should ever replace your own ability to think. Respect expertise. Listen to people who know more than you. Change your mind when the evidence changes, but never outsource your conscience, because at the end of the day, you're still the one living in your decisions. This week, notice the moments when you're automatically agreeing with someone because of who they are rather than what they're saying. Your boss, a doctor, a politician, a friend you admire, even me. The next time someone tells you what to think or do, pause and ask, do I agree because the evidence makes sense, or because this person feels like an authority? There's nothing wrong with trusting experts. Often it is the smartest thing to do. But it's worth adding one more question. Have I actually thought this through myself? The goal isn't to become cynical. It's to become conscious. The Milgram experiment has stayed with us for over 60 years, not because it gave us all the answers, but because it asked a question that still makes us uncomfortable. How much of what we do is truly our own decision? And how much is shaped by the people around us? Most of us will never sit in front of a shock machine at Yale. We don't need to. The real version of this experiment happens every day. Every time we choose whether to speak up or stay silent, whether to ask a question or simply go along with someone whose confidence or credentials make it easier not to. Those moments rarely feel dramatic. They feel ordinary. A conversation, a meeting, a family dinner, one small decision that resembles the one before it. That's exactly why they deserve our attention, and exactly why awareness matters. Not because it guarantees we'll get it right, but because it gives us the chance to notice the pattern before we're too far into it. If there's one thing I hope you take from today's episode, it's this. Curiosity isn't only about learning new things. Sometimes it's about questioning the things that feel so obvious, we've never thought to question them at all. Be sure to subscribe or follow wherever you're listening so you don't miss future episodes. And if you're enjoying the human pattern, leaving a rating or a review is one of the best ways to help more curious minds discover the show. Until next time, stay curious, question the pattern, and I'll see you in the next episode.